Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Friday, February 28th, 2025, and on Fridays we look at human behavior and justifications. I'll start today's vlog with a little historical anecdote or remembrance. Some of you may recall that the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, famously stood at the Brandenburg Gates back in Germany back on June 12th, 1987, and implored the then leader of the now former Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And more generally, the U.S. has a long history of opposing authoritarian and totalitarian regimes wherever they've existed, but especially in building up their alliances over the past 80 years since the end of the Second World War. Whether one fully believes or trusts the United States, there can be no question that they've stood by their Western allies and their NATO allies as a staunch defender of their countries and, in general, the principles of democracy and freedom. Certainly, there's some blemishes on their record as well, but without question, I don't think anyone could argue that through the Cold War right down to the present, and if you look at the manner in which the U.S. has stood by their allies, has provided international aid, has provided military aid in many instances as well, the U.S. has really been a beacon of hope against the threats of totalitarianism. And indeed, beyond what we've done abroad, the U.S. has also welcomed in literally millions of refugees and expatriates and those who have been at the risk of losing their freedoms or even their lives in regimes all over the world for several decades. So, and then on February 24th of 2022, Russian forces unilaterally stormed across Ukraine's border to launch a military offensive and a war now that it just celebrated its third anniversary this past Monday. And over these past 3 years, the United Nations General Assembly has approved various resolutions that have condemned Moscow's invasion and demanded the immediate withdrawal of Russian troops. Furthermore, the United States voted in support of all previous UN resolutions denouncing the Russian invasion and in support of Ukraine and their European and other institutional or international allies. So these are non-binding resolutions, of course, which essentially means that they're mostly symbolic in nature or an affirmation of alliances and support for sovereign nations, those who have been considered to have been victims of unlawful international aggression. And yet, something curious then happened on the third anniversary, on February 24th of 2025. European diplomats presented a detailed motion that once again blamed Russia for its full-scale invasion, while further supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. As expected, Russia voted against the resolution, as did Belarus, Hungary, North Korea, Syria, Israel, and Nicaragua. Ditto for Palau, the Marshall Islands, Burkina Faso, Burundi, the Central African Republic, Eritrea, Equatorial Guinea, Mali, Niger, and Sudan. But most remarkably, the U.S. voted alongside or in favor, or on the same side, I should say, as Russia. They rejected the proposal implicating Russian aggression. The U.S. diplomatic corps maintained that previous resolutions had failed to induce the combatants to end the war or to arrive at a truce. And so the U.S. proposed instead a more tepid resolution that did not implicate Russia as the aggressor, and that didn't pass. The key driver in the change of U.S. voting behavior in this instance seems to involve a different type of behavioral principle. that would commonly be understood in the study of political sociology and global politics in general as something called interest group theory, or in this case, what's in the interests of the United States. And so those who would support U.S. interventions in overseas conflicts usually have focused much more on the morality and the righteousness of the causes that are being defended. And the secondary feature has been that supporting pro-U.S. and or democratic regimes would help serve the U.S.'s geopolitical interest, again, in terms of building alliances and fortifying those alliances through, again, mutual shared interests. But I want to suggest that there's an even more important human behavioral principle at play that involves economics, and especially from a purely transactional standpoint. And what I'd like to argue today and defend, or my thesis, is that the shift in U.S. policy, whether one agrees with it or not in terms of your own politics, reflects a shift in the behavioral drivers of the U.S. government leadership. So it's not an accident, for example, that President Trump hired Elon Musk to head up the newly established Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, and has more billionaires in his cabinet than all previous presidencies combined. So as a result, we've seen an interesting continuum of polarization, especially in the U.S., but you could argue certainly extending beyond the U.S. borders as well. But a certain polarization has emerged. And at one end of the continuum, then, are those who wholeheartedly support President Trump's regime and believe that they're saving America, as the phrase goes. At the other end of the continuum are those who view the U.S. leadership's behavior as inappropriate, despicable, or even evil. And of course, a lot of people fall somewhere in between on that continuum as well. But here's my point. As with the stuff that I study things like hate crimes and homicides and family violence and even genocides. My job as a social scientist is to try to explain the behaviors that we observe, even that which I might personally find abhorrent or seemingly incomprehensible. And that's what I always try to do with my blog as well. That is to say, I'm trying to make sense, in this case on my Fridays, out of human behaviors and the justification processes that accompany such behavior. So, in the case of the 47th President of the United States and the new administration, I'll argue that they have assumed an almost exclusively transactional approach to both their domestic and foreign policy initiatives. What do I mean by that exactly? Well, transactional thinking involves a more purely economic approach wherein one weighs the tangible costs and benefits of alternative actions, but especially in terms of income and material resources as the basis for deciding one's course of action. Government leaders and their negotiators or support teams believe in striking the best deal for themselves and their constituents. But who then are their constituents, and or who stands to benefit more directly from any given negotiation? Well, that depends. So the interests served can certainly be those that are quite narrow in nature, especially in terms of the personal interests of the individuals themselves, like President Trump or Elon Musk, or might extend further to their intimate spheres, to their families, or perhaps to their friends and colleagues, or specific business interests, for that matter, a little bit more broadly. The interest at stake, though, could also even be entire sectors of the economy, or broader institutions that serve millions of taxpayers to varying degrees. You can even build the case that one might be negotiating on behalf of one's country as a whole, especially if one defines the interest in terms of their own sovereignty and, or as Adam Smith might have said, the wealth of nations. So sometimes the political leadership of a country has a direct interest then in claiming or acquiring resources to benefit their own industries and to huge sectors of their economy and their peoples in general to varying degrees. So by my estimation then, the current U.S. administration, including the president, the vice president, the national security advisor, and so on, have argued, and consistently now over the last several weeks, that Ukraine, for example, must recoup the costs to the U.S. taxpayers for the aid that's been provided, which has been estimated at over $100 billion. Some estimates are wildly higher. Those are inaccurate from all the available evidence. But nonetheless, whatever the exact figure is, it's obviously quite a bit of money. And as Timothy Snyder has pointed out, in Kyiv and again in Munich, the Americans proposed that Ukraine then should concede half of the profits from their mineral rights in perpetuity and from other national resources and from its ports as well, with a lien on everything important, really. And so that's the deal that the U.S. has proposed as a way of recouping their investment. Now, what's interesting about this, too, is that historically, and even in the current situation, the discussions typically involve securing reparations from the aggressor, all right? Who's the aggressor state? And then deciding what they should pay, how people should be compensated for their aggression, such as Germany and Japan following the Second World War. It's also been viewed as a strategically useful approach by raising the costs of war to the current aggressor and potential future aggressors as well. But then to justify their claims against Ukraine and for the U.S. to justify, for example, negotiating directly with Russia and without Ukraine at the table, the U.S. has had to invert the conventional logic to claim that Ukraine's responsible for the war primarily, and to hold them accountable then for reparations rather than Russia. And needless to say, Russia likes that approach, likes that framing tremendously. So from a purely transactional standpoint, it's costly for the U.S. to continue to support Ukraine or even other U.S. allies in general without benefiting more directly themselves, again, in terms of finances and material resources. And so by that logic, of course, the U.S. would definitely prefer that the Ukraine-Russia war end quickly, and so that Ukraine could then immediately start to cede, for example, their rare earth minerals and other resources as repayment to the U.S. It's fascinating and, quite frankly, a unique approach to international diplomacy. That is, essentially ignore the moral factors or the moral considerations, the human costs and suffering involved, the loss of life, and even the destruction to the social fabric long term, healthy partnerships and alliances in the future, political alliances. In effect, to focus more purely on what can be gained immediately and to serve U.S. economic interest on a long-term basis. So much more could be said about the Ukraine situation, and has been and certainly will continue to be, especially as negotiations unfold and the alliances perhaps begin to falter or realign themselves. I'm not going to predict the future in that regard, but I wanted to simply point out this kind of transactional approach that the U.S. is taking and expand the discussion in an effort to make sense out of U.S. international diplomacy more generally. So, for example, why would the U.S. seriously propose acquiring Greenland? other than for mainly economic reasons? Well, yes, a case can and has been made for the potential military or strategic advantages and security of Greenland, but those really, in my estimation, pale in comparison with the considerable natural resources that could be exploited. And so, from a transactional standpoint, the United States has been building the case to acquire Greenland from Denmark, preferably through some type of economic exchange, or a purchase price probably in the tens of billions of dollars. Of course, Denmark has resisted these overtures, and we don't know what's going to happen down the road. Similarly, what's the real interest in Canada? And why does Trump keep repeating the phrase about Canada becoming the 51st state? Well, in a nutshell, our unmatched resources. Never mind that the vast majority of Canadians reject the premise, or even find the rhetoric quite insulting. The point is try to build a case then for somehow acquiring Canada, convincing Canada to join up with the United States, again, preferably without a military invasion. And yes, then that logic applies as well to the acquisition of Gaza and the deportation of 1.8 million Palestinians from the region entirely. The human and cultural costs are not factored into the equation at all. And so from a transactional standpoint, the issue is one of acquiring the valuable resources or the land, investing then in the development of the region, and then again recouping that investment by profiting off of tourism and related industries. In short, regardless of your personal politics or views of capitalism and colonialism, I think it's helpful to strive to understand the logic and the reasoning behind U.S. leadership, their rhetoric and their actions thus far. A great many powerful and private interests stand to benefit tremendously from each of the aforementioned efforts at land acquisition and/or reparations. So the U.S. foreign, and I would argue domestic policies as well, have now become fully and unabashedly transactional. And from I'm saying that from an analytic standpoint, okay, purely from an analytic standpoint, as a social scientist. And so from such a perspective, it really doesn't matter then what the human costs are, or how many lives are lost, or how many families are displaced, or how many cultures are destroyed along the way. And trust me, those who support the transactional approach will also then develop other narratives and rationales to justify their perspective further. They may not like what I'm saying, as I'm merely simply trying to describe or explain the processes as they unfold. And in that sense, it behooves those who do strongly support a transactional approach typically to supplement their reasoning with other types of justifications as well. But most importantly, no amount of evidence could ever persuade such people to abandon the logic and the economic rationales that support things like making the Ukraine cede their mineral rights or resources, taking over Greenland or the Panama Canal, taking control of Gaza, or somehow convincing Canada to join the U.S., but interestingly, by the way, not Mexico. So can I be wrong? Of course, I might be wrong. And here's the kind of evidence that would contradict my argument today about the United States' overarching transactional approach to policy. So it could be the case, for example, in the weeks and months and years ahead, what if the United States, for example, continued to support the Ukraine and withdrew demands for reparations? Well, that would contradict my thesis, okay? Or if they pressured Russia instead for reparations, Well, that would contradict my thesis. Or if the U.S. helped secure the repatriation of the thousands, some would argue tens of thousands, of Ukrainian children who have been abducted by Russia. Well, if we did that, if the U.S. did that, that would contradict my thesis. And there are a number of other types of evidence beyond Ukraine, for example. If they were to send humanitarian aid and help the Palestinians to rebuild Gaza, that would contradict my thesis. Or for that matter, even helping Israel to redevelop their lands and areas that have been destroyed, all without requesting compensation. These would be the sorts of actions then, among others, I'm just providing some examples, that would prove me wrong. And indeed, I always acknowledge that I can be wrong. I might be wrong. My point is there are any number of actions that the U.S. leadership could take that would reveal something other than the predominance of a transactional approach. And if that happens, then I'll be the first to amend my thesis. As of right now, though, I'm purely basing my thesis on the evidence currently available. And that's what I do as a behavioral scientist. I work with theories of human behavior. I conduct research, gather empirical evidence, then to evaluate the theories that are currently available. And when the evidence contradicts the theory, doesn't fully support the theory, then I recognize and I have a responsibility to modify or change my theoretical arguments, or in some cases to abandon the thesis altogether if it doesn't hold water any longer. So I hope this has been a helpful primer into the nature of the transactional analytic framework. We'll explore the logic and the deeper issues involved in future vlogs, to be sure, including where and in what context the transactional approach tends to break down or tends to be abandoned. There are a variety of other sociocultural contexts that extend well beyond the purely transactional approach. And I'll hope to argue or demonstrate how that's possible and under what conditions or circumstances that would be. For now, though, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts, and give someone a hug today who needs one. Trust me, it's in your interest. It's to your benefit to do so. Keep well, and hopefully we'll see you soon.